Hello, everyone. Sorry for the delay, and welcome to this science webinar entitled The Women's Health Gap: Why Sex Research Matters. I'm Erica Berg, Director and Senior Editor for Custom Publishing at Science, and I'll be the moderator for this discussion. Around the globe, the gender gap stubbornly persists in many aspects of life, from work compensation to healthcare. There are many reasons for this women's health gap, including bias, stigma, and biology. Clinical trials have skewed male, while female-centric conditions like PMS and menopause are understudied. It's also become increasingly clear that chronic conditions, including cardiovascular and autoimmune diseases, can affect women differently or disproportionately. Today, our panel of experts will explore the unique health challenges that women face and the crucial role of sex-specific research in driving medical innovation. Before we get started, I wanted to give a few instructions about the viewing console. To the right of the video window is the Presenters tab, where you can find photographs and biographies of today's speakers. You can log into your social accounts during the webinar to post updates about the event. On X, you can add the hashtag #ScienceWebinar. After the speaker presentations, we will have a short Q&A session during which we will answer some of the questions submitted by our live online viewers. So start thinking about some questions and submit them at any time by clicking the Ask a Question tab, also on the right, typing the question into the message box, and then clicking Submit. Finally, a thank you to the Bioinnovation Institute for sponsoring today's webinar. I'd now like to take the opportunity to welcome our panel today. I'll give each of them a chance to say hello and introduce themselves. First, I'm very pleased to welcome Lisa Galea. Hello, Lisa.
Hi, very pleased to be here. I'm the Trey Living Family Chair in Women's Mental Health at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, Canada, as well as a professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. And I've been studying how sex and sex-related factors influence various brain disorders for about 30 years. I'm the lead of the Women's Health Research Cluster and the scientific lead of Women Mind at CAMH, and I'm an advocate for women's health research, so I'm very happy to be here.
Thanks so much, Lisa. And next, I'd like to welcome Henrietta Svar Nielsen. Hello, Henrietta.
Hello, good to be here, and I'm a medical professional, a chief physician in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology in Copenhagen, and I'm a professor at the University of Copenhagen. I'm also a grantee of the Bioinnovation Institute research grant, so fulfilling the circle, and I look very much forward to being here today.
Thank you, Henrietta. And finally, a warm welcome to Aris Papageorgiou. Welcome, Aris.
Thank you. I'm a professor of obstetrics and fetal medicine at the University of Oxford. I'm also a clinician. I work clinically and still deliver babies at St. George's Hospital in London. My focus is really on global maternal and perinatal health, through which I have a number of research programs, and I will be examining today data gaps in relation to that area.
Thank you so much, Aris. And we're going to begin with your presentation, so take it away.
Well, fantastic. So maybe we can, well, before we go to the next slide, you can see my Twitter feed there. I still prefer the little bird, I have to say. I think it's much cuter than an X. So please do follow if you so wish. And next slide. I'm just going to very briefly make any declarations of interest in that I am supported by a number of grants from UK, USA, and Europe. I'm a co-founder of a company called Intelligent Ultrasound who develop AI in ultrasound, and also some smaller additional companies. I'm editor-in-chief of the British Journal of OBGYN and chair of the Technical Advisory Group for Maternal and Perinatal Health at the WHO. Having said all that, I don't have any specific conflicts in relation to this talk today. What I wanted to talk about today was that even though women account for 50% of the population, still most health research that is not female specific is conducted in males. And even in basic science, such as preclinical animal models, research often involves mostly male subjects or only male subjects. So in animal experiments, male animals rather than a mixture or female animals. And the main reason for this is that female physiology is considered more complicated, and I'm going to put that on purpose in inverted commas with my little fingers. And this complication is because of cyclical hormonal changes, the menopause, which changes how female physiology functions, the use of contraception, often of many different types, but also even in, if you take that away, there are big differences between how men and women handle drugs due to differences in how the liver and the kidneys work. And this really has disadvantaged women. There's a lot of evidence that women, for example, will often be over-medicated because drugs to treat diseases were designed for mostly male subjects. They're adjusted for the weight differences, but not all these other parameters that we talk about. And because of that, if we go to the next slide, there has been a focus on disaggregating data by sex. But if you look at this slide, and this is a slide from the World Health Organization that talks about closing data gaps in gender, my highlights on there, says that collecting, analyzing, and using good quality disaggregated data is necessary to improve people's health, and that's very clear. And it's only in 2019 that the WHO themselves disaggregated data by sex for the first time. So this, to me, is a really interesting fact, given that we're in 2024. So this is not a long time ago. Next slide. And when we think about the data gaps then that affect women's health, we can think about them in kind of two different buckets of data gaps. One bucket is conditions that affect both men and women. So, for example, heart attacks, chronic pain, or other things like cancers. And here, the lack of disaggregated data and the lack of recognition of differences means that women, for example, are at higher risk of a misdiagnosis due to, just for instance, a heart attack. And then on the other bucket are conditions that really are affecting women, such as endometriosis, menopause, ovarian cancer, or cervical cancer, and don't affect men. And here we're talking not about a lack of disaggregated data, but a difference in focus and big differences in funding. And there's a study, I forgot here to put the citation, that in about 3/4 of cases, in conditions that affect primarily one gender, funding patterns favor males over females. Next slide. So what are the things that I wanted to talk about today? And I don't think I have solutions, but I think I have a lot of questions. And I sort of, to try and introduce a little bit the concept, is to think about these data gaps and how different trends that are happening around the world might affect these data gaps. And listen, there's lots of mega trends that people talk about. And, this is just one such model. And, I accept that there are others. But there are, for instance, in the first column, big shifts in global power. And if you click on the next slide, we will see that, for example, we have that the share of GDP, if you look at different regions, we have now emerging and developing Asia having a higher share of GDP in percentage terms than, for example, the European Union or the USA. And these are relatively recent advances, and this gap is getting greater. Now, what that means is that we need to rethink the way that the traditional models, the sort of US and European-centric models of healthcare work and healthcare research work. Next slide. And such shifts in global power, next slide, please, or next click, come into, for example, issues like this. Lots of data showing that passport inequities, for example, bars Global South experts from important health conferences. And people have been writing about this for many years in blogs. And there was a big issue in 2022 with an HIV conference, for example, where major researchers from the Global South were unable to attend a conference in Canada. So let's just think about that for a second. What does that mean in terms of data gaps? Is that helpful? Clearly not. Next slide. Then we have another big trend, which is rapid urbanization. And that has really big impacts in terms of models of care that we provide in maternal and perinatal health, for instance, but also in other areas such as infectious disease and pandemics, as well as non-communicable disease. And this is not an issue that only affects low and middle income countries, but if you look at the USA, which we'll see in the next slide, these are important data from the US. Next slide, please. Thank you. Where we have, according to the March of Dimes report, maternity care deserts. Maternity care deserts defined as areas where there is so little maternity care available, where in whole states you may only have single figures of obstetricians, for example, or maternal fetal medicine specialists. And of course, this disadvantages the people that live there, but also the groups of people that live there. So if you go to the next animation of the slide, please. And again, thank you. Talking about these changes being driven by loss of obstetric providers due to financial and logistical challenges, including the pandemic. And these disproportionately harm rural communities. And of course, also people of color, with 1 in 4 Native American babies and 1 in 6 Black babies born in areas with limited or no access to maternity care. This is the USA. This is not, a low income setting. Next slide. Think about demographic changes and how those may have impacts on how data gaps can emerge. Demographic changes such as changes in maternal age at the time of first pregnancy, the presence of underlying morbidities, smaller families, and declining rates of fertility. Next slide. And here, this is one aspect of multiple morbidity, and thinking about here deaths from coronary disease. And these are data from the European Union, which show that heart attacks account for about 12% of all deaths in the EU. And you can see that it's roughly speaking equally distributed between men and women, although not universally so around the continent. Next slide. But if we look at the outcomes and comparisons between women and men, we can see that women are much more likely to die within 1 year of a heart attack in the first 2 columns, more likely to have another heart attack within 6 years, and more likely to be disabled with heart failure within 6 years. So although women and men have the same, proportionally burden of disease in terms of occurrence, the burden of disease in terms of outcomes are worse in women. And despite this, next slide, what we find is that women are less likely to have an angio, less likely to have other investigations that are related to this. And the likely reason is that the classical symptoms, for instance, that are associated with heart attacks have been described in men and don't apply as well in women. Next slide. Of course, the information revolution, Dr. Google, patient empowerment, mobile technology, but also the potential for misinformation through social media is a very big issue. A random snapshot of tweets and messages from people talking about vaccines causing miscarriages in 50% of the population, increases in adverse outcomes by 4,000% due to COVID-19 vaccinations, and so on and so forth. So these are claims that have clearly been refuted in any scientific way. But because of the slow emergence of those data, this type of misinformation can very rapidly take hold. You have a really bad longer-term impact in terms of trying to overcome this kind of initial outcome. Next slide. Climate change, such as heat effects, pollution, food and water security are absolutely crucial. And of course, if you think about food and water security in low-income settings, that particularly influences women in that they will be disadvantaged disproportionately. And I think we can skip the next slide and go to the next one. Thank you. Just go to the next slide directly. Climate change, such as heat effects, pollution, food and water security are absolutely crucial. And of course, if you think about food and water security in low-income settings, that particularly influences women in that they will be disadvantaged disproportionately. And I think we can skip the next slide and go to the next one. Thank you. Just go to the next slide directly. And finally, the mega trend of emerging technologies, digitalization and AI, the availability of remote healthcare, the genomics revolution and surgical approaches, which are clearly things that we need to think about when we consider how different evidence emerges and when it emerges so very quickly. So in the next slide, you will see one, for example, issue that we've been working on, where we use artificial intelligence and pregnancy imaging in underserved regions. About 50% of women don't have any access to ultrasound during pregnancy. And many of you who are listening will have had a pregnancy in the family or in yourself, and you know that an ultrasound is really important to detect, for example, whether you're carrying a single baby or a twin, to detect viability of the pregnancy, the placental location, the growth of the baby. And what we've been developing is teaching computers how to read ultrasound scans in order to assist with the availability of very cheap technologies such as these handheld devices that you can see on this picture, but also enabling healthcare workers who may not be highly trained or very expensive to undertake such examinations. And there's a short little video on the next slide, which just shows a simple sweep through the abdomen. And I think you may need to click one more time. And the little boxes identify the different parts of the baby in the same way that a self-driving car might identify a pedestrian, a dog, or a truck. Here, the system is identifying the placenta, the amniotic fluid, the fetal parts. And some of these models are really crucial in trying to build up availability of very basic obstetric imaging in areas of the world where they just don't exist. Next slide. So I'm just going to finish by saying that in my lab and in our research work, we kind of have research in all of these little areas that I haven't shown you because we've only got 10 minutes. But our research and our thinking is guided by some of these trends that are occurring around the world. And I have one final slide, which is the next one, and that is an animated slide, because it's kind of thinking about how we can respond to the issues that we've talked about through research and innovation, training and education, implementation and implementation science, as well as advocacy and impact. And we cannot do that together as academic institutions. We have to involve collaborative networks, NGOs, advocacy policy advisors, industry, absolutely crucially, education institutions, hospitals, health systems, and others. And I'd like to close with those words and look forward to the next speakers who are going to show us, I think, some of these examples and how these different elements that come together to improve data and therefore improve human health. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Aris. And we'll be moving on to Henrietta next. Pull that up.
Thank you. And I'll use the next 10 minutes to talk about opportunities and responsibilities in women's health research. And I will start out with the first, that would be the second slide, please, just my disclaimers, nothing directly related to what I'm talking about here. And the next slide, please. Because my story that I would like to start with was that when I was a very young doctor, I became deeply interested in understanding pregnancy loss. It happens often, 1 in 4 pregnancies, and the many patients I met, they asked why did it happen? And what can they do to avoid another loss? And I really had no good answers. So I tried to get money to do a PhD. And after 31 rejections of PhD grants, I went in my grandfather's footsteps to Ethiopia and worked in an obstetric ward in Western Ethiopia. And I experienced firsthand the dangers of being pregnant in low resource setting. And what actually surprised me and shocked me the most was the lack of skills among the staff, and I really had no good answers. So I tried to get money to do a PhD, and after 31 rejections of PhD grants, I went in my grandfather's footsteps to Ethiopia and worked in an obstetric ward in Western Ethiopia. And I experienced firsthand the dangers of being pregnant in low resource setting. And what actually surprised me and shocked me the most was the lack of skills among the staff to handle life-threatening complications. And that was why I founded Maternity Foundation, with the aim that it should not cost life to give life. Next slide, please. And what we did was to take advantage of the mobile phone revolution in Africa, where more people have mobile phones than access to basic sanitation. And then we compressed global guidelines for handling life-threatening complication into short animated instruction videos. We developed quizzes, medication lists, and gamified learnings. And then in a cluster randomized trial, running for a year, we documented that having this app in the hands of the healthcare workers significantly and highly increased the knowledge of how to handle life-threatening complications, whereas the facilities not having the app stayed the same. So it is now almost 10 years since we launched the app, and by now, more than 430,000 healthcare workers have used this app that is freely available and that works offline once downloaded. And they have used that to make pregnancy and childbirth safer. Next slide, please. Returning to Copenhagen, I finally was granted, and I was doing my research in recurrent pregnancy loss and the maternal immune system. And those 4 years really opened my eyes to why and how poorly we define issues related to women's health and reproduction. And to be honest, it also raised a lot more questions than answers. Next slide, please. And that was the reason that I, back in 2011, started dreaming about making a huge step towards understanding why 1 in 4 pregnancies are lost. And that was the motivation for the Copenhagen Pregnancy Loss Project, the Couple Project. And next slide, please. And this is just to show you the timelines, and also to keep encouraging people who want to do research and say, I mean, just keep going, because the idea was there in 2011. We started wrapping up grant applications in 2013. And now you may say, oh, she is so bad in writing research applications, since it took her until 2017 to get funded. But I would actually say that having done so many research applications as I have, I have learned so much. So I would say it's more that we were prematurely there. And I got feedback like pregnancy loss is not a scientific subject. Pregnancy loss is not interesting because we know that it's because there's something wrong with the fetus. That's nature's quality control. But in 2017, we got 1 million Danish kroner from the foundation of the Danish legal family. And that got us started, and we got ethical approval in 2018. Decode Genetics from Iceland agreed to do whole genome sequencing of pregnancy loss trios, father, mother, and fetus, if we could get this project funded. And that was where the Bioinnovation Institute came in and gave us a huge grant in 2020. And we had money then to include 1,500 trios. And we started November 2020. And in 2023, we obtained funding to increase to 3,000 pregnancy loss trios. And until now, we have included 2,650. And if we take the next slide, we can see that we include couples above 18 years of age that present with a pregnancy loss of a confirmed intrauterine pregnancy. And in addition to inclusion visit, they also have to accept a follow-up visit 6 to 8 weeks after, where they are provided with the ploidy status of the fetus, where they get another clinical evaluation and repeated sampling. Next slide, please. And here is an overview of samples and visits. And we recently received an additional grant to follow closely 1,000 of the 3,000 couples from the very start of their pregnancy until their next pregnancy. And we have linked the data we collect to the national registries that is really a powerhouse in Denmark. And next slide, please. And this is to show you what has taken so many years to try and really get together. That's the data modalities in this project that we want to have. And that includes the whole genome sequencing, cell-free fetal DNA, lifestyle, fetal characteristics, what we can get out of the urine of the couples, the mental state, endocrine status, semen characteristic, register data, as talked about before, blood biomarkers, microbiome, and the health records. And next slide, please. I think what I've just shown you is what I believe are the obligations of clinicians and researchers. What I show in this picture is patients, because they have changed so much from when I started. In 2001, there was nobody talking about their pregnancy loss. Now patients are not just talking about it, but they require answers to why it happened and what they can do to avoid it. Next slide, please. And also the journals have taken responsibilities. In 2021, The Lancet came out with the Lancet Miscarriage Series, and one of the most outspoken editorials I have seen concluding that the era of telling women just to try again is over. And next slide, please. Nature Medicine follows, having a theme issue throughout 2024 on women's health throughout the life course. And still, I see well-funded and huge studies being rejected. And I think that reflects the huge underinvestment for decades and the huge knowledge gaps, because women's research can, in a lot of times, despite these huge improvements, look immature and low level compared to what's out there in other disease areas. Next slide, please. Oh, there should be another one just before this one with the world. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so that was the Nature Medicine. And if you take the next one, that's the world. Please, next. Yeah. So World Economic Forum and McKinsey came out with this report when world leaders met this year in Davos. And the report brings a clear ask to focus on women's health, because it's not only valuable for the woman, who would then spend less time in poor health, but it's also very good economy. And the potential is huge for those daring to invest. And then this final slide, please. We see an increased interest from investors, but it comes with a huge dilemma. And because what we see again and again in investors who want to bring things to market is a clear focus on treatment, aesthetics, and wellness. And what's really lacking is the deep understanding, because we will have no treatments until we understand the biology. And that's why what I would really like us to discuss today is how should we accelerate getting knowledge? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. Lisa, you'll be our final presentation today, and thank you so much. Start when your slides come up. There we go.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about my very favorite topic, women's health research. As a neuroscientist, I focus on the biomedical aspects of sex and sex-related factors impacting brain disorders. However, I want to make it clear that gender also plays a role. Gender is more than gender identity. It is a psychosocial construct, how a given society has expectations of our roles and conduct given our gender identity. And though I focus on sex and biomedical approaches to women's health, the disparities I'm going to be talking about are manyfold greater in people of color, Indigenous, trans, and gender diverse individuals. And it's really important to acknowledge and understand the experiences of these different communities, as they'll have a different influence on health and disease risk compared to men and women. Next slide. There are numerous sex differences in the prevalence of brain disorders. In blue, you can see, maybe even think, many of them turn up earlier in life, whereas the ones in pink are more likely to show up a little bit later in life, suggesting along with a sex-based approach, we need a lifespan approach as well to understanding these disorders. However, prevalence is one thing. Something that's more interesting to me and is perhaps more challenging is that there are manifestation differences as well between males and females across a wide variety of disorders, not just brain-related, making it more complex to diagnose and treat if sex and gender are not taken into account. Next slide. A large Danish study found that for over 980 different disorders, females were diagnosed 3.7 years later than males were for the very same disorder. Now, there's going to be many reasons for this, both on the biological and social side of things. But I think one of the major reasons is because most of our medical research, including the way we diagnose people, has been done solely based on research in men and experiences in men. So much so that, next slide, symptoms in females are called atypical, and you see this atypical label across a wide variety of disorders, those with a greater male prevalence, those with a greater female prevalence, those with no sex difference in prevalence at all, suggesting that there's a systemic bias. And we have to think about this label. Words have consequences. They have consequences for researchers, publishers, funders, and the people that are experiencing these symptoms. They don't feel atypical to the people experiencing these symptoms. And this suggests that, next slide, males cannot serve as a default for females, as has been the longstanding thoughts. We see too many differences in manifestation and prevalence of different disorders, but also at a cellular level. We have XX, XY, X0. They exist in every single nucleated cell across the body, and not just in our reproductive tract. Also, we have different hormonal transitions across sexes and genders, and those also have consequences for our health and disease risk. We cannot assume that males are a stand-in for females because it's like comparing apples to oranges. Next slide. Now let's consider the example of late onset sporadic Alzheimer's disease. There are a number of non-modifiable and modifiable risk factors, and sex plays a role in every single one of these factors. In fact, 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are female, and 50% of Alzheimer's patients have one or two of those ApoE4 alleles. And it turns out the sex plays a role here as well, as females with these alleles have an even greater risk than males to develop Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. Recently, the FDA approved a drug targeting a neuropathological feature of Alzheimer's disease to combat cognitive decline. Understandably, this made headlines. Next slide. But what is not seen in the headlines is that this drug worked to a greater degree in males, but didn't work very well in females. And it also doesn't work very well for those individuals that have two of those ApoE4 alleles. So in other words, it's not very effective in those people that are more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm not saying we should throw this drug out. It is effective for a subset of the population, white males without the genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, which effectively is what precision medicine is all about. However, this drug also has some severe side effects, and a recent paper came out exploring who is more likely to experience these side effects. However, an analysis on sex and gender wasn't done. Now, we need this information to make informed decisions. If females are not receiving the same kind of improvements with this drug and also are suffering from more severe side effects, we need to know that. Next slide. And although it's concerning that that paper didn't do an analysis by sex, I can assure you this is true of most papers that are published even to this day. We did a very large study where we looked, even though in 2019, 70% of articles in neuroscience and psychiatry were including both males and females, only 5% were considering sex as a discovery variable, meaning that they could determine whether sex influenced the outcome. Next slide. Neil Epperson's group also looked at neuroimaging studies in psychiatry and found that when sex was used as a discovery variable, 72% of those studies found that sex played a role in the outcomes. In fact, other studies that have used sex as a meaningful or discovery variable have found that it can improve power, and that's work involving asthma and schizophrenia. Next slide. However, studying sex and gender is only going to get us part way. Women's health is more than comparing to men's health. We already know that these female-specific experiences can drive health outcomes and disease risk. And when we use males as a constant comparator, we risk that atypical label. It ignores the fact that these female-specific experiences are varied. There are many kinds of pregnancies, including pregnancy loss, many kinds of hormonal contraceptives, menopausal hormone therapy, menopauses, and each of these can differentially affect our health outcomes. And not just in the health of what it lies under our bikinis, because ovarian hormones affect every major organ in our bodies. Next slide. However, there's a shocking gap in how much research is done in women's health. In neuroscience, there are 9 times more male-only studies than female-only studies. And across all time, 2% of neuroscience research is done examining these women's health questions. Next slide. I've been studying how female-specific experiences can inform on depression and Alzheimer's disease. And my take-home messages are studying who is getting the disorder and when is critical to building effective models, both clinically and preclinically. As too often, we're modeling our disorders on the younger males, resulting likely in these atypical labels. We really need to start rethinking our long-held beliefs, given that most of our work has been done solely in males or agnostic to sex and gender. For example, is our modeling, our algorithms, are they done based on data derived from males at a specific age? And lastly, I think that it's really important to embrace the heterogeneity within sex and within gender and within these female-specific experiences, as collectively we can learn a lot by harnessing the data heterogeneity, and we can use this to clarify inconsistencies in the literature. Next slide. For example, I study how pregnancy alters brain health in both the short term, postpartum depression, as well as in the long term. And Anne-Marie Delang's group found that there are signs of decreased brain aging in middle age. However, others have found an increase in Alzheimer's risk later on with grand parity. And so we've been studying what we're calling the parity paradox. How can you both have a healthy brain aging as well as an increase in Alzheimer's risk? Next slide. If we come back to these non-modifiable risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, we looked at the intersection of female sex and ApoE4 alleles, as well as pregnancy history. Next slide. And what we found using a measure of neuroplasticity called neurogenesis, which is the production of new brain cells in an adult brain in an area called the hippocampus, we found that in middle age, previous parity was associated with an increase in these new brain cells. However, next slide, that was only true in the wild type animals. And the animals that had these risk for Alzheimer's disease, this ApoE4 alleles, we found that they had a decrease in neurogenesis. And we've also examined other aging biomarkers and found that previous pregnancy can have a different effect based on your risk for Alzheimer's disease, much like the healthy cell bias that was proposed by Roberta Brinton to explain differential effects of menopausal hormone therapy on the brain. Next slide. Lastly, I want to point out that perinatal depression is defined as depression during pregnancy or the postpartum. However, research from the Uppsala University showed that there are different subtypes. You can have depression throughout, or depression onset only during early pregnancy, or only in the early postpartum, or only in the late postpartum. And biomarkers change really dramatically across pregnancy and across postpartum. And these biomarkers can give us clues on the etiology and treatment options. And understanding that there are these different subtypes is key to unlocking precision medicine surrounding this disorder. Next slide. I use these examples to point out it's not just about comparing apples to oranges, but the fact that there are many types of apples and that heterogeneity matters to understanding health and disease within all sexes and genders. Next slide. Unfortunately, we don't know that much about women's health research, and this has been alluded to already. Research is underfunded in the US, in Canada, and I dare say across the world. Next slide, surrounding this disorder. Next slide. I use these examples to point out it's not just about comparing apples to oranges, but the fact that there are many types of apples and that heterogeneity matters to understanding health and disease within all sexes and genders. Next slide. Unfortunately, we don't know that much about women's health research, and this has been alluded to already. Research is underfunded in the US, in Canada, and I dare say across the world. Next slide. What happens when we ignore women's health research? Delays in diagnosis. We've already looked at that, which represents a missed opportunities for earlier interventions. And we know that that's crucial for their effectiveness. It results in slower adaptation to precision medicine. It costs lives, and it costs the economy. As Henrietta was talking about, the World Economic Forum report suggested we could save $1 trillion a year if we invested appropriately in women's health research. Next slide. What can we do? We can invest. All you have to do is look at the Ice Bucket Challenge and see how successful it has been and will be for ALS. In 5 years, they doubled the number of papers and publications. And next slide. we can raise awareness. So I really applaud the Bioinnovation Institute and AAAS for hosting this event. It's really important to get the word out that women's health research is underfunded, undervalued, and understudied. Next slide. You can join groups that raise awareness about this really important topic. I'm the lead for the Women's Health Research Cluster, which is a worldwide organization, as well as Women Mind, which is at CAMH. And we want to empower people to study more women's health questions and to disseminate evidence-based information across all disciplines. Next slide. And I hope in these few short minutes, we've all convinced you that understanding the basic neurobiology and disease mechanisms in males, females, and intersex individuals will lead us to better individualized treatments for disease. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I know I'm convinced. And thank you to all our presenters. We're going to go right into our questions. Online viewers, you can still submit your questions over there on the right, but I know we're going to go maybe 5 minutes over since we started a little late, and I know our friend Aris needs to drop off, so we're going to ask him a few questions first. So here we go. Aris, you managed to set up a successful company in women's health as a researcher and clinician. Can you share a few words on how that came to be, and what would be your advice to others who might be considering this journey?
This is a bad conversation to have when we're running so far over, because it's a long story. But what happened was there was a pain point, and there was a pain point in that we were doing our global ultrasound studies or our global maternal health studies, but we had no availability of ultrasound in those settings. So this was at the very beginnings before AI was really trendy. Back in 2012, I spoke to my excellent colleague Alison Noble, who's an engineer at the University of Oxford, and asked her whether we could not teach computers how to recognize pictures, ultrasound pictures. And, she took up the challenge. And after about 3 or 4 years of heavy lifting on the academic side, the university saw that this was a potentially a valuable proposition, and they helped us spin out the company. So it was a spin out from the University of Oxford, supported by some excellent people and donors along the way. It took, when you look back, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of effort. And of course, Henrietta can speak about this too, but it's also extremely fulfilling and rewarding. As an academic, it was a massive learning experience, because it's such a different way of working than in academic practice. And I certainly enjoyed it, and I did it again.
Thank you. So Aris, again, what obstacles are we facing for implementing solutions worldwide, right? So what are those challenges?
Some of the challenges I outlined today, and I think certainly in maternal global health, the inequity of access to care in general, but more specifically in underserved populations, in low income settings, and in particular, the gap between men and women. And of course, my research focus is pregnancy and perinatal care. So, in some sense, I'm less impacted by this inequity because by definition it is maternal health that I look at. But there is still, a pot of money that's available not just for research, but in general for healthcare provision. And if you think that the research pot is not equally distributed, the less work has been done on the healthcare pot and how that's distributed. But I can guarantee you that the picture will look very similar. So one of the challenges is distribution of healthcare provision and between men and women, and then within different populations, ensuring that those people who are hardest to reach, and we saw the example of maternity care deserts in the USA, still have access to care. So I think that would be certainly the top of my list.
Great. All right. And one more for you while we have you. So what is the next big question in fetal and maternal medicine, both from a basic and translational research perspective?
When you look at an antenatal antenatal clinic today, and you look at a picture of an antenatal clinic from 100 years ago, it looks remarkably similar. And that's, to me, is just such a surprise. How is it that in every aspect of our life, we have wearable sensors, we have monitors that monitor our every movement, be it a little watch that counts your steps, an iPhone that gives you the latest piece of information. And yet, if you have a pregnancy care, you have the traditional model of someone having to come to hospital, be hooked up to a sensor that's probably plugged into the wall. It's, really an area that's ripe for disruption. If you look at the rules, and if you look at the Harvard Business Review of the rules of what constitutes an area that's ready for disruption, antenatal care and pregnancy care meets all of those criteria. So we do need to think about how we can provide care closer to home, more equitably, and with less interference, having to come to hospital, and less interference of our daily lives.
Great, thanks so much. And drop off whenever you need to. We're going to move on to Henrietta. Someone thanks you for your amazing work in this space, passing that along. So when and how will your diagnostic test be available for patients?
We hope very soon. I mean, we have been in the incubator of the Bioinnovation Institute, and we hope very soon to be able to raise money and actually build that company that we have prepared for throughout the project. Hopefully, we will be able to put something to the market within the next year and making it available for everybody needing to know something about why did that loss happen and what can they do to avoid another one.
Wow, that's really exciting. Thanks. Another one for you, Henrietta. For many years, you have researched pregnancy health, trying to understand the causes of pregnancy loss. What is the next big question you're looking to answer?
Yeah, but I think here we're looking at a lot of things that are interconnected. So, I mean, in our cohort of pregnancy loss, we see at least 10% who have endometriosis. We look at the ultrasound pictures and we see a lot of adenomyosis. We have 15% who have polycystic ovarian syndrome. And we also see 20%, and that is how our cohort is enriched, that has infertility. So I think just using this dense data set, originally, made for pregnancy loss, we can use it to answer a lot of deep questions about the other women's health diseases and how they are interlinked. And I think that is what I'm really, really curious about for the next few years. I would love to have the long-term outcome here that we will get through the registries, and that will keep me until I retire, to look at, can we find the biomarkers where all the reproductive traits are actually affecting cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, and brain diseases later in life. And I think that's where we'll kind of again end the circle, because we have to look not just at the diseases that affect women, but also at those that affect both men and women, but where we know that there's huge differences and reproduction plays a role in that difference.
Great, thank you. Lisa, which psychiatric and mental health indications should we prioritize for pushing innovation in women's health?
I mean, I know everybody wants the prior, what's the most important thing to pay attention to? I think that's a really hard question because we know so little. How can we really answer that? So, mental health in outside of everything else is also quite underfunded, which is really surprising given that 1 out of 2 of us will have experienced it at some point in our life, which is pretty amazing, right? So that means that somebody, either ourselves or somebody we love, will be experiencing a mental health crisis. And so I would say probably the top ones, even though I just said we shouldn't prioritize depression, that happens to be one that I tend to look at. But it is about 20% of the population that experiences some form of depression and anxiety. And I think we really need to think about how we diagnose people. As I said, those atypical symptoms arise. And so are we asking about those atypical symptoms? Because there's this idea that, there are probably prevalence rates of depression equally between men and women. But if women are more likely to have those atypical symptoms, do we actually ask about them on our short, quizzes and things like that?
Great, thank you. This one is also for you, Lisa. How close or far are we from developing sex-specific treatments for disorders of the central nervous system based on our current understanding of biology?
I'd say we're really pretty far away because people aren't doing it, right? We can't, if only 5% of people are actually analyzing to see if that makes a difference, we're pretty far away. There are some examples and I think of brexanolone, which was an FDA-approved drug, the first one, I believe, for postpartum depression. And I don't think any of the data is out, but it doesn't look like it's super helpful for males. And it also looks like it might not. It's a synthetic version of allopregnanolone, which is a metabolite of progesterone. It doesn't look like it looks like also that could be a driver of PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So while it might be helpful in one situation, it might worsen another situation. And I think these are really important questions. And coming back to Henrietta's point, we don't know a lot of the basic biology in females because of a point that Eris made. People thinking that hormones are so disruptive to our biology, so why should we use females? What maybe is less well known is that males, rodents and humans, have a diurnal fluctuation in testosterone that's 50%. There's a 50% decrease. That's huge. So they have a daily fluctuation. Females have a monthly, or if you're a rodent, 4-day fluctuation. So my standard joke is like, who's more hormonal now? So I think we're pretty far away, but I think that has a lot of promise, right? If you think lecanemab works in white men that don't have an ApoE4 allele, that's good for cognitive. That's good for those white men. So let's figure out what the other drugs are that will work for women.
Great, thank you. And I think
non-white men.
And I think this will be our final question. It's actually for all of you. I'm glad you're still here with us, Aris. Maybe you can go first. But do you have any key advice to young researchers entering the field? Are there any advantages of entering a field that is understudied? Aris?
So sorry, I'm muted. There's massive advantages of going into a field that's understudied because there's more work to be done. I think the challenge always is to try and convince funders that your research is important, as Henrietta has shown us. But I feel I'm an eternal optimist, and I definitely feel that this tide is changing through initiatives such as this one that we're hearing. So if I was going into research now, my daughter's just about to start university, and we're kind of thinking, what should we be going into? I think biological sciences are top of my list. Genetics is probably, or genomics is probably within that one of the things in the top of my list. And I would certainly go into a women's health related subject.
Henrietta?
I will just echo that, and I would say, please join us, everybody who has the heart and the willingness. I think it's definitely worth keep trying to get results here.
I'm gonna echo that, but I'm also gonna be a bit of a realist, and maybe it's because my DMs are filled with people saying I got the comment on my grant to add males. So one recent one was on hormonal contraceptives, but I've also seen it based on work in the placenta, exercise during pregnancy. it's not important, it's not novel enough, people trying to publish. So I do think please join us, because it's so easy to make the novel argument because there are so few people doing it. I do hope the tide is turning, and there's lots of really great publications in the Lancet and JAMA and Science about why this is so important. But I really encourage funders, and that's why the Innovation Institute is so great, to ring fence funding for women's health, because it stops the questions on why is this important if it's only for women's health research. And then for some people who think that's going to be exclusionary, I also think it's really important to understand that anything we find within this heterogeneity of these different diseases, it could help another gender in another situation. And so it's all really important information. But I think in this business, no matter what you're in, you need to be persistent, but especially in women's health.
Thank you. Fantastic advice. And we'll have to stop there. Thanks for hanging in there with us. And many, many thanks to our panelists today. It's been a delight hearing about your research and about women's health and having this chat. I learned a lot. Thoughts on this webinar, please email webinar@AAAS.org. Thank you once again to our panel and to the Bioinnovation Institute for enabling this conversation through their kind sponsorship. Goodbye, everyone.